I'm going to go ahead and move forward and introduce our first speaker to kick off this day, Robert Blizzard. He's going to really set the tone for the day to explore what is next for Ohio in terms of politics, polls, and power. We've had the opportunity to work with him here recently. He's the founder and CEO of UpOne Insights. It's a leading Republican pollster with 2 decades of experience advising presidential campaigns, U.S. Senate and gubernatorial races, congressional candidates, and state legislative caucuses across the nation. He's guided corporate research for Fortune 500 companies and national associations on messaging, brand, and crisis management. A Clemson University graduate, Blizzard previously spent nearly 20 years at Public Opinion Strategies before launching his own firm. So welcome, Robert, and let's get started.
Good morning. I just think that's weird, but a lot of my kids' sports coaches do that. Good morning. I am thrilled to be here today. I think we've got 30 minutes or so, I think is the time on this, to walk through a couple of different things. I think number one, we're in an interesting political moment, so I thought I'd walk through some kind of the current political environment out there, the landscape, kind of the issues, maybe a little bit of a preview going into the 2026 elections, even though that's still a year out. And then, as you mentioned, we partnered recently with some work on behalf of Groundwork and First 5 Years Fund, and we have some polling data that we're going to show from that as well. That'll be kind of fun and interesting. Look, first, the national political environment. Not a great way to start the day, but we are in a unique moment, right? We are in a very polarized, partisanized political environment that is not showing any signs of improving or getting better. It's been this kind of, what I've kind of called this cultural Cold War, has been going on for quite a while, whether you're on the right or on the left. Just kind of back and forth. Every time there was something that comes up, there tends to be, instead of a meaningful dialogue across the parties, right? Everyone just kind of retreats to their partisan corners and automatically lines up against what the other side is doing. And both parties are, and politically and legislatively, both parties are certainly part of that. I think the challenge now, as we've seen kind of over the last couple years, on both sides, there's just a ratchet up now of political violence, right, on both sides. And it's kind of a weird, not a great look, right, for the country or for the time. But part of this, the reason I spent a minute on this at the beginning of this deck is, part of this is it just should demonstrate to you that even elections and campaigns now are very different than they used to be, right? There are very few swing voters anymore. Ohio is a great example of this. Ohio, really up until the last 6 to 8 years, was really one of the most competitive swing states in the country. You had about the same percentage of Republicans and Democrats in terms of how voters would ideas in terms of their partisanship. They had very close elections. They voted for Bush. They voted for Obama. Then they voted for Trump. So it's just been a competitive state. There were a lot of states like that. And now what's happening is you got red states, and you've got blue states, and then you've got a narrowing number of these battleground states across the country. And the challenge with that is it means that this has a direct reflection on politics and on legislation and on what your lawmakers in states and in Congress care about, because they are much more focused. If you're a Republican, you're much more focused on what your Republican primary electorate thinks. And if you are a Democrat, you're much more focused on what your Democratic primary electorate thinks. And so it's not better, it's not worse, it is, right? This is what's happening. And so I think it's always just something important to kind of keep, in the back of your mind. Trump's job approval, Trump's job approval was not that great in his first term. He high 30s, low 40s, lost re-election to Biden in 2020, had a really bad year for Republicans in 2018. His approval, though, since he was, re-elected last November, has been, much better. It's still not great, but it's much better historically for Trump, right? He's been sitting in the mid to low 40s Even during the shutdown, which I'll talk about in a second, his numbers have been, pretty consistent across the board. And he's just a very people love him or they hate him, right? He's a very polarizing figure. And so what that means is that the president has a very high floor in terms of how low his numbers can actually go, but also a pretty low ceiling, right? Very difficult to see Trump's approval rating, as you can see here, move out of the 43 to 48% window. The days of, which are kind of crazy to look at now, but you look at the top left of that chart and you see somebody in the, Obama in 2009 was in the 50s. You go back historically, look at like where Bill Clinton's approval ratings were throughout his term. George H.W. Bush, Reagan, we had guys that were sitting at some points in 50s and the 60s. Those days are gone, right? Because we are just in such a polarized environment, which makes, it kind of speaks to the first slide. In terms of the issue agenda, this was from a national survey done by the New York Times, and they did what we call in the polling biz an open-ended question. Give me what are the most important issues facing the country today. So not giving them choices to pick in a survey, but just leaving it open for them to articulate the answers they want. And you can see the things that are really popping in voters' minds. It's the polarization, it's the division, as we've kind of talked about here briefly on these slides. It is the economy, which I'm going to talk about more in a second. Obviously, Democrats say the biggest problem is Trump and Republicans. Republicans say the biggest problem is Democrats. The democracy kind of corruption that's being talked about more, that had risen to more of a fever pitch during the 24 election. Kind of went down a little bit, but what's happening now, Ohio is a little bit immune to this because you kind of have these redistricting laws in place every couple of years and all that. But as you see what's going on across the country in other states with redistricting, if you're paying any attention to this, voters are certainly paying attention to this, and they're keeping an eye on what's going on in Texas and Florida and California and Indiana and these other states that are now really changing things. And so it's giving kind of a fresh look now at concerns about democracy, overall. Mom Donnie, I want to make sure I have his name right, New York City, running for mayor. He is running a very strong campaign, and a lot of people, I think, are looking at the mechanics of his campaign, how he's talking about things, where he's going, how he's on social media, how it's kind of a fresh look at a race. I think he's going to win the mayor's race because he is, of this year, one of the few campaigns and candidates that's doing one thing really well. He is talking about the issues that voters care about the most, which is affordability, and locking in and focusing on that issue. The number one issue since really coming out of COVID, 2019, 2020, 2021, has been affordability, inflation, rising costs. There has been little improvement. And even if there has been statistical improvement, well, okay, inflation's now only at 2.2%. Last year it was 4.2%, whatever. The bottom line is voters, Americans, Ohioans, everyone is not feeling it, right? So the Obama campaign ran through a struggle with this in 2012 when they were running for re-election, which was they were touting good economic numbers, right? Jobs were getting better. We were coming out of the recession. We were coming out of, what happened in 2009 and so on and so forth. The problem is that voters across the country just didn't feel it. They're like, I still having trouble making ends meet. And that's the same situation we are in today. I mean, look at these numbers. You've got 58% of voters across the country think that grocery prices are a major problem for them and their families. 58%. Housing costs, 49. Utility costs, 46. Healthcare costs, 51. This isn't just, it's a problem. Yeah, I don't like it. This is defined as a major problem. And what's hard is you guys are all very strong advocates for the issues that you're going to talk a lot about today. But one of the challenges that you face and everyone else faces that's in this kind of environment and landscape that we are in is that your issues are being completely crowded out by other things as you see on this list, right? Affordability, the economy, that anxiety about jobs, that is across the board. Republicans in particular are much more focused on immigration and public safety and crime as kind of their secondary issues. Democrats are more typically focused on healthcare and abortion, climate, the environment, things like that. So when it comes to issues like early childhood education, childcare in general, I mean, it's going to be important, as you'll see in a minute, to talk about these through the lens that voters care the most about, which is how are we helping improve people make ends meet? How are we making things more affordable? How are we helping in this kind of current economic environment? That's not to say, look, Trump's getting a lot of hit and a lot of heat on the economy now. Any president would. There's some support, as you can see here, for the crime crackdowns, across the country. I think Democrats, just, to put on my political hat for a minute, Democrats have to be a little bit careful about looking, a little too like, well, we don't want to have safe streets and safe crime, even though they don't like Trump, right? And so that's a little bit of a challenge. And then I think similarly on immigration, one thing that has really shifted now over the last, I think, 3 or 4 years, and one of the things that kind of catapulted, Donald Trump within the Republican Party was the hard line on immigration. And, I think this was a very interesting way of looking at this, which is if you look at the left side of the screen, do you support or oppose deporting immigrants living in the United States illegally back to their home countries? And a majority, 54%, do. Obviously, Republicans are pretty in on that, but a majority of independent voters, 52%, and 1 out of 5 Democrats. So, I mean, when you look at the policy itself, there's pretty good support for that. But if you look at the right side, right, is Trump going too far? Bit about right, or not gone far enough? Everybody's like, well, Trump's going too far. So it also is a good reminder of just the lightning rod, right, that the president is when it comes to issues and policies and so on and so forth. Because even if voters are supportive of the policy, they may not like the messenger. And we saw the same thing, a couple of years ago on the left, right, where folks were maybe supportive of aspects of something like within the Green New Deal in a poll, but then when they were told it's AOC and Bernie Sanders, opposition just shifts and changes completely. Because a lot of times now in this polarized, partisanized political environment that we are in, voters just look for those partisan cues, put on their team red or team blue jerseys, and then go fight the battles of the day. The other thing I think is just really interesting is the where we are in terms of institutions and institutions in terms of mainstream media in general. Very few now, all-time low, say they trust the media. And you can see only 8% of Republicans trust the media, a great deal or fair amount. Independent voters, 27%, and then Democratic voters now only at 51% also. So trust in the media is another kind of institution that has declined. All right, terms real quick for the election before we get to the Ohio numbers. I think, look, number one, things change, right? I was just at a dinner last night, and I heard from some of my Republican friends that like, wow, this is great. Republicans are just going to be ruling for years in office, and everything's going to be fantastic. And all. I was like, this stuff is going to change again and again and again. And that's what it is. It's very cyclical, right? And it's how it is. I mean, you look at this is national. You go back to, again, 2008, Barack Obama comes in, huge, massive coalition, wins the presidency impressively. It's, quote, the end of the Republican Party. How are they ever going to survive, right? It's going to be gone. And then 2 years later, Republicans win 60, plus seats. And then, you saw what happened in 2016, Trump, oh my God, Hillary Clinton, she was our champion. How are we going to be able to do anything? The Democrats are gone forever. And then 4 years later, they throw Trump out, put Biden in, right? And this is going to change. This is cyclical. And you could see it typically changes, in a hurry. I think going into the next election, I think one of the big advantages that Republicans have over Democrats is that Republicans, even though voters may disapprove of the policy, voters still have more trust on Republicans' handling of the top issues of the day. They still think that Republicans are better equipped on the inflation and on economy, on crime and public safety. on immigration. So some of this comes into elections now becoming less of a referendum, right, on one party or one person and more of a choice. And so, obviously, if it is a choice, right, that's very beneficial for Republicans. However, if it's a more of a referendum election, which, to be honest, typically is in midterm election years, right? It's usually a referendum on the party in power, that could benefit Democrats, just as it benefited Democrats, in 2018, just as it benefited Republicans in 2014 and 2010 in these midterm years, right? The other thing is the parties have changed a bit. Republicans now are now a party predominantly of voters that do not have a four-year college degree. And that is a big, big change from when it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. This is not your father's or grandfather's Republican Party, right? It's very different. And as that has happened on the right, what has happened on the left is the left has become the college-educated, college grad party. And so that has, I think, significant implications for messaging and language. And all my Democratic friends that I work with a lot are like, we need to start simplifying language. We're getting up in our ivory towers and being too academic. But importantly for campaigns and politics and elections, what it means is that Republicans are now very reliant on what we call low propensity voters, people that don't typically, can be counted on to vote in every single election. Whereas Democrats now have a coalition that are much more likely to go vote in elections at a higher rate. And so as you've seen over the last year, when you look at special elections for Congress, Democrats didn't win some of those, but look at the difference in terms of the percent the Democrat got in those elections versus what Kamala Harris got the year before. And we're going to have a couple elections coming up in Virginia, my home state, New Jersey, governor's races, where we'll be able to see if there's also, some differences there as well. Harris, I think, got 52% in each state. So did the Democratic candidates, Spanberger, Cheryl, running for governor, do they exceed that margin as well? And this typically happens when you're the party out of power, you usually have more motivation and energy because you're angrier, and angry people vote, right? That's usually how it works. It's kind of a weird map. I don't think that's the map I put on the chart. But we could talk about, it must have been just a PowerPoint thing, but it's no big deal. We could talk about that big governor's race in Brazil. But look at the chart on the right side. So one thing, Ohio, one of I think 35, 33, 36 or so states in 2026 that has a governor's race, right? So a lot of governor's races across the country. Right now, Ohio is not really deemed, I think, to be too competitive. Now that can change, right? Everything can shift and change. But right now, I think most political prognosticators would put Ohio kind of in that, likely Republican category, as the state seems to have kind of been going, a little more red over the years. Something happened here. There we go. Looking at the U.S. Senate, the U.S. Senate is probably very tough terrain for Democrats. Probably. Although that seems to change now by the day. They have, as you can see, kind of working your way left to right here, Virginia, New Mexico, Minnesota, probably, pretty safe for Democrats at this point, but it's, incredibly early. New Hampshire, former U.S. Senator John Sununu just got back in the race yesterday, which gives Republicans a little bit of fresh blood there and fresh energy in that race. That could be very competitive. Michigan and Georgia now, North Carolina, those three are, quintessential presidential U.S. Senate Gov battleground states. So those will be kind of wild to watch. Maine will be very competitive. And then here in Ohio, you've got John Husted now as the senator running against Sherrod Brown. Should be a really competitive race, here in Ohio. Again, advantage to Husted just based on kind of the tilt red of the state that we've seen these days. But Sherrod Brown is he's a tough out. He's going to raise a lot of money. He's has a lot of experience. So you have potentially a competitive race here, and then Iowa and Texas also on the map. Congress, I mean, I don't even know why I keep doing these charts on Congress. Every day there's a new thing that changes. I mean, I think the maps just passed in North Carolina. I think I saw on the plane out here yesterday. So trying to keep track of what redistricting is going to look like in all these states has just been silly at this point. There's going to be fewer competitive swing districts across the country. And, again, what that means from a legislative standpoint is that your Republican legislators in Washington are going to be more focused on what their Republican Party folks across the country care and think about, and it's going to be the same thing on the left, right? The Democrats are going to do the same thing. And in some extent, you've seen some of that probably here in Ohio. I remember I was first working in the state 10, 20 years ago. It was very competitive, state house, state senate race. It was state house more so than state senate, but state house races across the state. And that's just not really the case anymore. Now you're up over, I don't know what Republicans are up over now, probably up over 60 seats or so. But it makes it more difficult to really see the need for R's and D's to work across the aisle to get things done. All right, in terms of Ohio, so again, this is data from the survey we worked with Groundwork and others on. And so this is Ohio statewide data. And I think some of it you'll see are, dovetails with some trends that we saw and we see in some of the national data, which number one, it's affordability, right? So when you ask folks, what are the most important issues facing you and your family? It's lowering the cost of living. It's lowering the cost of living. It's lowering the cost of living, right? You also just got to think about it in terms of it's very hard to have a voter or anyone think about complex infrastructure projects or complex policy arguments when they are going to the grocery store trying to figure out, am I gonna make this work this week? Right? It's really hard. It's very, very difficult for a lot of families, and it crowds out everything else. When people start feeling more financially secure, it's easier to have, okay, well, now I'm feeling good. Now we can talk about, some of these other things out here. But it's just very, very difficult. And I think the second most important issue here, better economy, more jobs, I think this is something that's starting to rise up a little bit also. Wages for folks, right? There's a little concern still underlying, but I think it's going to grow exponentially over the next few years of things moving a little fast with this AI. What's happening with artificial intelligence. So there's some big things coming with the economy. And you can see, it's Republicans, it's Democrats, whether you live in the Cleveland market, Cincy, Youngstown, the small kind of rural markets down kind of southeast Ohio. The issue agenda is not really all that different. These numbers are also, this is a pretty depressing presentation at 9 a.m. These numbers are depressing. So this is, again, Ohio statewide. You see the voters up top. You see just among parents in Ohio, which is our sample of parents in the poll. And this is basically, do you face this challenge? 44%. I don't know if this will do it. No, it didn't do it. 44% of Ohio voters are unable to pay their complete credit card bill every month. That's almost half. A third say they're struggling to pay their rent or their mortgage. Who isn't, right? Struggling to feed their family, 1 out of 4, Putting off or expanding or starting a family because of the cost of childcare, 20%. Look at parents, a third, not being able to save money or get ahead financially due to childcare costs. I'm working with the folks' first 5-year fund, especially now over the last year or so. My kids are a little bit older now, so we're not in that childcare issue, right? But hearing, I can't believe I just said that out loud. Wow, getting old. But hearing now these some of the data, some of the numbers, the average cost costs send 2 kids to childcare, the economic cost of it. It's just, some of these numbers are just astronomical. 26% struggling to pay childcare costs, cutting back on other household essentials before childcare. It is not, this, bottom line, guys, this is not a pretty economic picture, right, for most people in Ohio. And we did similar polls in other states. This is not an Ohio thing, right? I mean, it's bad in Ohio, as you see. This is everywhere across the country, whether it was a Midwest state, if it was a Southern state. This is where we are these days. Nearly 80% of Ohioans say that the ability of working parents to find and afford quality childcare is either in a state of crisis or a major problem. So we basically gave them four parts here. Is it crisis? It's a major problem, minor problem, or not a problem at all. And 78% say it's a crisis or a major problem. 2/3 are Republicans. So this is, not a lot of issues these days where you also have, as we were talking earlier, where R's and D's, believe it's a problem. Now, Republicans are a little softer on it. That makes sense. That's just how they are about, a lot of things. But you still got 2/3 of Republicans that say it's in a state of crisis or a major problem. Parents, non-parents. As I said earlier about some of those economic numbers, inflation, rising costs, I think one of the key points when we were going through the data with the groundwork folks, we talked about how this is driving or could drive a workforce economic crisis. Remember, that second most important issue in Ohio is economy and jobs. And when you look specifically at parents here in Ohio, more than half of parents say they know someone or themselves would go into the workforce if they had quality childcare available. So you got folks on the, we call it in sports, right? You got people on the bench that would be willing to go and make more money and, go get a job, maybe get a second job or go get a bigger job, high paying job, but are not doing so because of the lack of quality childcare. So there's clearly an economic component to that. And that kind of messaging, I know, look, we're in a red state. Let's just look at the realistic points out there. That's an effective message with Republicans in Columbus, up on Cap Square. Make it an economic argument. We asked about federal funding for childcare. So I think looking at the left side, do you think that federal funding for childcare and early learning programs for low-income working families is a good investment or a bad investment? 66% say it's a good investment of taxpayer money. Parents and non-parents agree. On the right side in Ohio, do you think that federal funding for quality childcare programs should be increased or decreased? You've got a majority of voters in the state think it should go up, including, more than 2/3 of parents. So voters are also looking at this through the cost-benefit kind of analysis. Are we getting our money's worth right now? And most people think, it's a good investment. We should continue to invest those dollars. And you have a majority of folks here that say it should go up. We should be spending more dollars on it. I love this chart just because it shows a couple things. One, it's a great data point to talk about publicly, right? But number two, it shows you how quick voters are to put on their partisan red and blue jerseys, right? So the question was, do you support or oppose the expansion of the federal child care tax credits that were in the One Big Beautiful Bill, right? To help make child care more affordable and available for working families. So overall, 60%, strong majority by a 3-to-1 margin, voters support these child care tax credits that were in the One Big Beautiful Bill. Look at the partisan differences here, though. Not probably what anyone would expect, right? Usually you think, well, Republicans they'll support it for sure, but they'll just be a little softer. Because it is encapsulated in Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, Democrats are like, I don't know about that. Whereas Republicans, hell yeah, 72%. I would love whatever Trump did in the One Big Beautiful Bill. But that's, again, it's a reality of the political moment that we are in. And so I think, look, this is what it is. Use it to your advantage, right? Use it to your advantage. Ohioans should pass their own One Big Beautiful Bill that includes these child care tax credits, just like the president did. Have a Republican tell you they won't do that. You got to use this stuff to your advantage a little bit. But anyway, I just think that's just so interesting because, again, it shows people's, I'm not going to side with anything that Trump did. just immediately. And then you're going to have other people that are going to be like, they don't really understand it, but because Trump said it, right, they're going to be supportive of it. That being said, what I think is some of the most reassuring, encouraging, and positive data here is we asked folks, okay, Congress just expanded these tax credits in the One Big Beautiful Bill. Should they go further? And so my thought is the pollsters would be like, well, this is where you're going to start to see people pull back, right? Republicans in particular. Not the case. 2/3 of Ohioans say that even though they just passed these child care tax credits, that Congress should go further. That's a good number. 61% of Republicans. You got a significant majority there, more than 2-to-1 Republicans say, let's go further on these child care tax credits. That's a great number. Democrats are obviously on board. Look at MAGA. We looked at people who are just, describe themselves as MAGA. 64% say go further. So those are great public talking points. Head Start, basically, I think these are really good numbers for Head Start. I think the key is just making sure people know what the hell Head Start is, right, and educating people. But I'm being serious about that. I'm being serious with that because I think when I look through these numbers on Head Start, I think some of the softness, especially you see with Republican audiences, is they're just not really sure what it is. And I think just more education is necessary about what the program is. But when you look at the surface, nearly 80% of Ohio voters support it. 2/3 of Republicans, 2/3 of Trump voters. Democrats, largely on board, almost 90% support Head Start. And keep in mind, we gave them that definition. We gave them, as you see, very tiny parts of the screen there, that it's a federally funded, locally run program that provides early learning, health, and nutrition services to young kids from low-income families. To make sure people are all on the same page. And so we could have some actionable data out of that. And then on Head Start, we asked about should we support or oppose eliminating federal funding for this? 2/3 of voters oppose that, which I think is obviously terrific. Majority of Republicans are against it. Majority of Trump voters in 2024, and a majority of those who describe themselves as MAGA supporters, which again I think is really very good data here. And then finally, last slide here. We looked at a number of different proposals being talked about at the state level in Ohio, and wanted to get a sense of. We didn't do I don't think a super deep dive into these, but wanted to get a sense on overall where did these test. And for the most part, all of them test pretty darn well. The lowest one, as you see on this screen, is at 68% support, which is at the bottom. But if you go to the top and kind of work your way down, tax incentives, benefits to businesses which provide or help their employees find and afford quality child care programs, 83 to 12. 83%, there are no issues that now you have support in the 80s on, right? And I think the benefit of that is, obviously, if you're up in the 80s, guess who you're getting a really large portion of? Republicans, right? Because they like that idea of bringing business in. Some of the other work we did for first 5 years, I was talking about some of those partnerships that you can build, public-private partnerships, and to move the needle, and voters, really like that. The second one on paid family leave, state-funded paid leave program, so that working parents have paid leave for the first 6 months, or 6 weeks, of the baby's life. 76 to 20. Very strong support for this. Create a new state refundable child tax credit benefit for families with children, which can be, used on any household expense. The ones that are toward the bottom, I think also test really well, right? You're at the 70% support, you're at 68% support. I think they need to understand a little bit more about, what Head Start does. We did some work for First 5 Years Fund and others on this to talk about some of the specialized services, really just get it. Because right now, if you don't know much about the program, you're going to be less likely to kind of defend it and want to stand up for it. And so the more education you do, the more you can say, hey, this is what it's doing. And then the other thing is, I think that's our last slide, and then I'm happy to take questions the last couple minutes or so if we have to move on. The last thing I would say is, with all this stuff, it's not all that different from a political campaign or from a TV ad that you would see. It's who are the messengers for delivering this information, right? And make it about the families and the kids. I know you do as advocates, right? I know you do, but I think showcasing that to other people about who this stuff is really helping, putting a face to it so they just don't think of it as a line item in an Excel spreadsheet is obviously really incredibly important, across the board. So I don't know if we have time for any quick questions or one or two, sure, or we can move on. If they're not too bored. Nope. You just shout it out if you need to.
Thank you. You obviously have been working in and around Ohio politics for a long time, and given this polarization and where the numbers are, do you have a thought about whether or not, from a strategy standpoint, going directly to the voters through a ballot initiative makes sense in this environment versus continuing to incrementally kind of work through the legislature, where even the legislature itself is just super polarized?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I've worked on a lot of ballot issue campaigns here in the state too over the years. A lot of it depends on the timing of the ballot issue, right? I would not, depending on what's in the ballot issue, but usually if you could have a ballot issue on in a high turnout election year, say a 2026, right? With pretty simplistic language in the ballot issue, that would probably be far more successful than if you had it in an off year. That's very complicated. A lot of times what happens with ballot issues is they start off with very high support as voters like, sure, it sounds great. But when you look at the language, political animals and operatives like me will find ways to pick it apart and attack little parts of it. And what generally happens is that voters don't really pay much attention until you get very late in the campaign. And if voters are unsure about a ballot issue, they vote no, right? So it's usually what the yes number is throughout the surveys. So, I mean, I go all the way back to the casino work from, a long time ago now, 15, 16 years ago, where, it was just hovering around the low 50, 51, 52% on the yes, because everybody else was just kind of undecided on it, and they turned to vote no. So it's timing, it's language, what's in it, and you need probably some help from the Secretary of State to help with that a little bit, I think, on the language side. Yeah.
So, sort of piggybacking on that, have you done any polling that looks at whether or not, if you ask people to rate where they would put their money, is it in, K-12, early childhood, higher ed? We're going into probably a very tough budget, as many states are, in a couple of years. And I think often there are trade-offs, obviously, that have to be made.
Yeah, but voters are they're not good at that, let's put it that way. Because voters are usually pretty selfish, right? So I have 2 kids in K through 12. I don't want money going to anything but K through 12, right? But no, I'm serious, that's what a lot of parents will think. So it's an interesting exercise, but I think in a poll, that's what the challenge would be, is you would just see people looking at it kind of through a selfish lens. What would be interesting to be asked people, what percentage do they think it should be? And maybe give them what percentage it is now. Because we all do this, like, I'm not even sure what percentage of all this money goes in or certain dollar amounts. That would kind of be an interesting way to look at it, I think. I think that's it. I think it's all I can take. Sorry. That's all I can do. But I appreciate your time today. I appreciate it. And hope you guys all have a good rest of the day and enjoy the governor today. Yes. Thank you.